All right, Frank Gaffney joins me today, Center for Security Policy, Executive Chairman over there, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com, also the Vice Chair in the Committee on the Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org. Frank, I guess let's start with the fact that you sent me an email today at 4:34 in the morning. I never sleep, and I was asleep at that moment, which is it just shows you that you must really never sleep, Frank. It's quite an early email.
I hope I didn't wake you up, Alex, with it, but I was aroused myself by what I consider to be a pressing matter.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about it. So you're seeing a connection here between the very energetic left-wing movements in the United States at this moment and the Communist Party in China. Walk me through your thinking.
Well, one of my great go-to guys on matters of the enemy within is Trevor Loudon, an author and filmmaker of a book and a movie by that name. And one of the things that he wrote about in Epoch Times recently was research that he's done into the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to emphasize this isn't about Black lives mattering or not. It's not about, the terrible tragedy that took place in Minneapolis and all that. This is about the movement.
For the Soros-funded freaks, quickly, which is no one disputes that Black Lives Matter, which is part of the genius of their sloganeering, which is that they make it seem like if you oppose this far left radical communist group, that you oppose the concept that Black Lives Matter. Of course, that's absurd, but we've all basically accepted it, and it makes us all walk on eggshells around these group of radicals. So it's a tricky ploy, but we're not falling for it. So
to be clear, we're being compelled to accept it. It's not just a question of looking the other way. Anyway, the point here is that, as Trevor points out, in addition to just the generic strain that is now evident in so many of these leftist movements of radical anti-Americanism, revolutionary fervor. In this case, an outfit called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which has gone through a number of permutations, had a group split off. For a time it was using the same name. It now uses the name Liberation Road. Both of these are Maoist, Chinese Communist Party tied, I think of them, enemy operations inside our wire, inside the United States. Liberation Road, Trevor writes, was the outfit that spawned Black Lives Matter. And what moved it from just another brand, just another entrant in the rather large, he says there are 20 prominent communist organizations operating in the United States today, and maybe 100 more that are lesser lights. But these two helped engineer, particularly Liberation Road, helped engineer in the context of the rioting that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, a few years back, a huge concerted branding campaign to make everything about and drive people to Black Lives Matter, the organization. And along the trail, we've lost sight of the fact that the three women who started this thing up, are Maoists, very, very well documented pedigrees in, sort of Marxist revolutionary fervor and movements associated with it. And what we're seeing playing out here, Alex, is two things. One is we are seeing that revolutionary agenda being advanced, and we're seeing any effort to even decry it, let alone actually counteract it, being met with a kind of totalitarian suppression. And it's being enabled, Tucker's, I think, done a pretty good job of documenting all this. It's being enabled by corporations that are pouring, I think he said last night, $250 million into Black Lives Matter movement, the organization. This is being churned into not only Act Blue and related Democratic Party operations for electoral purposes, but it is being used, I think, very concertedly to silence us, to intimidate us. And I think they're getting away with it to this point, and why I, at 4:30 this morning, was writing you saying we have got to get the American people focused on the true nature of what we're up against here, to realize that there are things that we can do about this, and to stand up and Lee Greenwood's anthem, "Proud to be an American," was sort of rattling around in my head as I was writing you. This is a moment when those of us who are proud to be Americans need to be standing up and heard from.
And the people who Black Lives Matter is working right now are, first of all, they're just people who think they're open-minded, maybe a little liberal, and are filled with love and want to do good by their fellow man and hate racism and hatred. And step one is you get their attention, you get them to say Black Lives Matter, and then step two is then just, oh yeah, by the way, we're communists now. I mean, that is basically the game plan here, and yet it is being almost completely ignored. In fact, if you dare to mention it, you risk getting thrown off the internet at this point. Mm-hmm. So,
among other things bad that can happen to you, right?
Sure, of course. Yeah, lose your livelihood, et cetera, and the public shaming, all that stuff. So let's talk about what, and you guys have some reporting on this at the Committee on the Present Danger China, that China is using telecommunications networks and capital markets to spy on the Americans, American governments, American companies, and citizens. How are they doing this, and what do we need to know?
Well, you actually reported on this last week. There was an investigation that was conducted by a subcommittee of the Senate that I used to work for a long time ago, called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Governmental Affairs Committee, House, Senate, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And what they basically did was they drilled down on the fact that for about 2 decades, 4 Chinese telecommunications conglomerates, China Mobile, China Telecom, China Unicom, and a company that's a subsidiary of a monster defense contractor for China called CITIC, that's known as Comnet. These outfits were inside our wire, in a manner of speaking, wireless as well as, I guess, wired carriers in this country were using technologies that these folks were providing. And as is generally the case with stuff that the Chinese manufacture, if it can be used against us, it will. And in this case, the subcommittee discovered that for the better part of those 2 decades, the Chinese were spying on us, using our own networks and the carriers to do it. And successive governments of the United States, under, I'm sorry to say, both Republican and Democratic administrations, essentially turned a blind eye to this. Part and parcel of what we have been decrying now on this program and elsewhere, in the committee and elsewhere, Alex, which is that, we have failed utterly for decades to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is our enemy. It is at war with us. It is waging unrestricted war against us, in fact, as they call it. And the longer we persist in blindly ignoring this, the greater our danger. And the real kicker, which we've been working very hard on, as you know, with the Committee on the Present Danger China, and people can find out much more about it at presentdangerchina.org, is, at the minimum, to stop underwriting the warfare that the Chinese are waging against us. And get this, Alex, three of these Chinese telecoms that have been using our networks to spy on us have been listed on the New York Stock Exchange to get money out of our markets. The 4th CITIC has been also getting money out of our capital markets. So we have been, in effect, paying them to spy on us. So when I mentioned a moment ago that there are things that we can do about this, I very strongly believe, and we have appealed formally to Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin, who has been put in charge, I'm sorry to say, by President Trump of figuring out what to do about the fact that the Chinese not only have access to our capital markets, not only have taken perhaps as much as $3 trillion out of them to underwrite their malevolent behavior towards us, but they have actually been getting preferential treatment in the process. No answer yet from Steve Mnuchin. I honestly don't expect one. But if we don't fix that, if we don't stop financing our enemies' operations against us, and most especially allowing them to do it on terms that our own companies don't get with respect to transparency and accountability and risk disclosure, we've got nobody to blame but ourselves for having financed the selling of the rope with which they will hang us.
Ray Gaffney, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.com, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. Let's go to Committee on PresidentDangerChina.org. Let's talk a little bit about what's news that's happening in the Far East. North Korea has bombed the liaison office with South Korea. They were speaking twice a day, the North and South, for a very long time, a couple of years, I think, and then all of a sudden the communication abruptly ended. North Korea started saying all sorts of horrible stuff about South Korea, and they bombed this liaison office, reducing it to rubble, according to our reports at Breitbart News. Despite the fact that, leftist Moon Jae-in is tried to appease North Korea all the time, not enough. It's kind of a common theme here. What's going on here in the Koreas?
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study, isn't it, Alex, of sort of the playbook of the North Koreans. The playbook is issued to the North Koreans, though, we should remember, by the Chinese Communist Party. There would be no North Korea today. There would be no Kim Jong-un. There would be no nuclear program in North Korea, no long-range nuclear missiles, if it weren't for the active and ongoing and generous support of the Chinese Communist Party. So I personally think what's going on here. Why is the Chinese proxy here behaving badly at this particular moment? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is expected shortly to meet with some senior Chinese counterpart. And what the Chinese like to have as a feature of these kinds of talks, especially when things are as difficult between the Chinese and us as they are at the moment, is to hold out the prospect that if only we're nice to China, they will control or at least improve the behavior of North Korea. So, I mean, it's a classic mafia sort of shakedown. You got a nice liaison office here. It'd be too bad if something happened to it. These guys are actually, I think, just trying to engineer advantage for China by having the North Koreans behave badly. Now, might they behave even more badly? I think so. Why? Because it works like a top with, as you say, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea. He's desperate to unify his country with North Korea on the North's terms, for heaven's sakes. I mean, basically, abject surrender of his people and freedom to North Korean tyranny. There's also, of course, I think the other piece of this, which both the Chinese and the North Koreans, and oh, by the way, the Iranians and the Russians, and just about every other bad guy you can think of, Maduro and so on, seek, which is, of course, the defeat of Donald Trump. And if they can say that Donald Trump's efforts to denuclearize the North Korean peninsula failed abysmally, and now the North Koreans are behaving badly again, well, that plays into this larger narrative of which we were speaking a moment ago.
Okay, Frank, so let's talk a little bit about some of this nuclear developments that China is undertaking, adding 30 nuclear warheads to its arsenal in 2019. Your reaction to that?
Well, let me just say, first of all, this is an estimate that has come out of lunatic leftist organization, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI they call it. We have no idea how many more nuclear weapons the Chinese have put in their arsenal in the last 6 months, a year, 5 years. It's all a guess. And you know why, in part, Alex? Here's a dirty little secret. We tumbled upon, amazingly, through some enterprising research done by some graduate and undergraduate students at my alma mater, Georgetown University, under the leadership of a professor there by the name of Phil Carber, who I used to work with in the Pentagon, that the Chinese have built 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels in their country, principally, we think, to hide their nuclear missile force, their ground-based missile force. They run them around in these tunnels. Well, you know, there are those who believe that they only have basically a handful of missiles and they have a handful of nuclear weapons, relatively speaking. I don't think you build 3,000 miles of tunnels to hide stuff if you're only going to have trivially small numbers, hundreds or scores of missiles. I mean, please. What these guys have been doing to hide those nuclear forces, to build them out, to increase both their survivability, of course, but also their ability to engage in preemptive first strikes, is to invest massively. I mean, think about it. That's roughly the distance, back and forth across the United States, continental United States, 1.5 times. This is a stupefyingly vast civil works project, shall we say, or military construction, more to the point. And you know who financed that too? We did. So the threat is real. It is growing, no question about it. But I don't think it's even close to the numbers that those guys are talking about. It's probably an order of magnitude or more larger.
Remarkable, yet not at all surprising. So, Frank, also a couple other items in China I want to address with you. There's apparently a massive coronavirus outbreak in Beijing. It's really interesting because I always wonder, because they have such a closed press, why they're allowing certain information to come out, and who does it hurt and who does it benefit. And I don't have this one pegged exactly, but it does appear that huge portions of Beijing are under lockdown, which is interesting. It gives you the thought that maybe there is some sort of a second outbreak. What do you think is going on there? And what do you think? Let's try to read between the lines, between the information we're getting.
Well, it may just be that they can't really conceal what they're doing. There are reports in Breitbart, I believe, that 20 to 30,000 people are being rounded up, put on buses, and sent heavens knows where in Beijing. That the city, it's being declared is in a wartime status, essentially, lockdown and so on. I have to tell you, Alex, and it's just a hunch, I can't prove it any more than we can prove a lot of things that the Chinese have been doing in this pandemic business with their CCP virus. But it wouldn't surprise me, having seen them launch, or at least do nothing to stop, the pandemic from spreading to this country with devastating effects. If there is going to be a second wave in this country, perhaps also launched by them, that as they did in Wuhan, there is some evidence that they're having trouble with this too. So it doesn't look like a biological attack. Even as a practical matter, that's what it turns out to be. I don't know. I hope not. But I will tell you that I'm aware of some extremely exciting information about what I think is actually a cure for this horrible disease, and one that will not be susceptible to the kind of, evolution, shall we say, either engineered or naturally occurring evolution of the virus. So watch this space, because it could be a game changer for this country and for the rest of the world as well. And it's an American breakthrough, and I'm very excited that I think it may change the course of both our own present crisis as well as perhaps prevent us from being subjected to the kinds of things that the Chinese have unleashed on us just in the course of this year.
So you're saying like a medical cure or more of a theoretical cure?
No, an actual medical breakthrough that I think will take out this disease. I'm not at liberty to say more at the moment, but we will be shortly, I think. Watch this space.
I'm sure you will.
Stay tuned, folks, as they say.
All right. Okay, so last thing I wanted to mention, Frank, with you is this. We're looking at this moment with China where Beijing is going back into lockdown, and I want to connect this with our immigration policy, which is still largely unchecked. And we've got this massive levels of unemployment rate, got massive amounts of debt, and then we've got viruses streaming in throughout the world into the United States, and I'm seeing almost no immigration discussion, not as a national security issue, not as a financial security issue. And this is something that I'm hoping that I can use my ample platform to try to get at least some immigration discussion back in the picture before we go to vote in November. Any thoughts on this?
Alex, I don't follow this as closely as I'd like to, but one of my go-to resources on that subject is Numbers USA. They have a fabulous person who I assume you know, Rosemary Jenks, who is their Director of Government Relations. These guys do incalculably important work. And she has been warning for some time that there is an effort underway to come up with some sort of comprehensive reform of immigration. We've been wildly distracted from it by other things, of course. I think this is another of Jared Kushner's initiatives. Generally speaking, I'm not terribly keen on them, and I think while this one may have more going for it in some respects than others, because I think he has got some good people working on it, this is really fraught in an environment where, in the absence of the sentiment that the American people, I think, have consistently shown about the need for, not only the securing of our border, but also the enforcement of our immigration laws internally to the United States, we wind up seeing the same folks we've been talking about throughout the program. These revolutionaries, these radical, enemies of our country really taking the lead and contributing to this problem rather than helping cure it. So I hope that this is actually going to be getting your attention, Alex, and those of an awful lot of others of us, because it should be a voting issue this fall. And if we don't vote properly and get the right people in office, not only to fix this, but to address these myriad other problems from China and, the pandemics and all the rest, the enemy within, not least, we may well lose the country.
Frank Gaffney, really appreciate it. Thanks so much, my friend. We'll come back and talk to us next week.
I look forward to it. Thank you, my friend. God bless you.
We'll be right back.